Hi everybody, welcome to Leading for Life Stories Season 2. My name is Bob Judson and I'm your host for this podcast, and I'm absolutely delighted to have you here joining me. Thanks very much, and I really hope you enjoy what follows. Welcome back everybody. I've been blessed to have some extraordinary guests on the podcast so far, and I'm grateful to each and every one of them. But I have to say, today is a really special treat. My guest is Flight Lieutenant Colin Bell, Distinguished Flying Cross, who is 103, very nearly 104 years old, and a World War II Mosquito pilot from the Pathfinder Force. Colin's exploits during that time are absolutely amazing, and his life story is an amazing one. And it's incredible that he is still so fit, so healthy, so fully capable of remembering everything that happened during that time so long ago, and having a great sense of humor and living a great life even to this day at this great age. It was such a privilege to interview him. And I thought I can't miss the opportunity to expand this a little bit. So joining me on this particular podcast is a great friend of mine, and actually a former instructor of mine from when I went through flying training, Nick Anderson. And Nick hosts a podcast called Plain Tales, which itself is a featured segment of a longer and broader podcast called The Airline Pilot Guy Show, which has such a great aviation connection that I thought it was too good an opportunity to miss. So that's why Nick is with me, and you'll hear Nick's voice occasionally as we go through this. And this will obviously be one of his plain tales. In fact, he's going to break it down into several, I think, of his plain tales, which are shorter segments over the next few weeks. And I really hope you're going to enjoy it. It's a fascinating conversation, and one so worthy of being given some serious airtime. So please do share this one widely if you enjoy what we have to say. Here we go. Colin, what a privilege to have you here today. Thank you so much for joining the podcast. I'm delighted, and I'm equally delighted to be joined by my great friend Nick Anderson, the host of the Plain Tales podcast, and I think we're going to have a great time talking about your life and career.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you, Bob, and thank you for inviting me. And I'm always happy to engage in these discussions and to pay tribute to everything that the Royal Air Force, and in particular Bomber Command, has done.
Yeah, I know. I'm just in awe, really, of what you have achieved. I think it's amazing. You've had an absolutely incredible life. And now at the tender age of 103, you're still more active than an awful lot of people 30, 40 years younger than that. Yeah. So, I'm amazed with what you achieve.
Well, just get the record straight. It's 103 nudging 104.
I know, yeah. March next year, isn't it? Is 104. That's just an incredible achievement. And to see you so fit and well is great. I think just to get us started, could you just give a bit of a summary of your life so far? We're going to talk a lot more about your wartime experience specifically, and we'll have some questions that we'll talk to you about that. But just a summary from your point of view, your life journey as it is.
Well, my life journey started when I was 2 years old, and I was visiting my father in hospital as a toddler, and I walked down a central corridor with curtained off sort of cubicles on either side, and one cubicle was open, and as I passed by, there was a Joan Collins lookalike in there, and she called out to me and said, "Little boy, would you like some grapes?" And I said, "Thank you." And from that day onwards, I've been a absolute the sucker for Joan Collins lookalikes and grapes.
Fantastic.
So that's 2 years old. Then, of course, I go to the period when I was a teenager, and I was listening to my mother and father talking about the horrors of World War One, as well they might, because so many people lost lives in that dreadful battle. And, of course, they were appeasers to a man, and so many of their generation were. They were very, very nervous that in the 30s that if Churchill was brought in, as my father said, he'd have us into a war with Germany the day after tomorrow. So they were intent on appeasing Hitler and avoiding that situation. And, of course, as we now know, appeasement never works. And so, therefore, fast forward to 1939, when war broke out. In 1940, I'd been watching the Battle of Britain. I wasn't at that time in the Air Force, but overhead came a German bomber, and it slung a bomb out at Hampton Court Bridge, and I was walking towards Hampton Court Bridge, and I could hear this bomb coming down, and I thought it was going to land at my feet. Well, it didn't. It landed on a house the other side of the road, and it's a jolly good job it was a light bomb, otherwise I shouldn't be talking to you this morning. But it covered me in dust and dirt and everything else, and I thought, well, I always intended to volunteer for the RAF, and I thought, well, this gave it greater impetus. And I thought, well, if I get into the RAF, I might even be able to catch up with this guy. But of course, I never did. It didn't work out that way. Yeah.
Why the RAF rather than the Navy and the Army? What motivated you early on to the Air Force?
Well, I think every red-blooded young man at the time of the Battle of Britain wanted to get into the RAF and fly an aeroplane, a fighter, hopefully. And I was no exception. The idea of being in the Army didn't appeal to me, still less the Navy. And so the obvious arm to go into was the RAF. And but it wasn't easy, because at that time, I suppose for every aircrew training position, excepting perhaps rear gunners, there were perhaps 12 young men trying to get in. And the RAF were, selection board, pretty picky. And when I went up before an interview board at Oxford, there was a group captain, and on his right a shrink, and on his left an engineering officer. And I could feel the chill in the room. I wasn't doing very well. And I think the engineering officer, to get me sort of away, said to me, and I remember it very clearly, he said, "You tell me," which meant he didn't believe me, "you tell me that you could strip down a motorcycle engine and put it back together again." And I said, "Well, I've done it." "In that case," he said, smiling at the group captain, "you won't have the slightest difficulty in telling me how fast the camshaft runs in relation to the crankshaft."
Oh, my goodness.
And I said half time, which was the right answer.
I'm glad I never got asked that question.
He looked very nonplussed. And, but the group captain laughed. And when the group captain laughed, of course, everybody laughed. I was in.
What a great
I often wondered, Bob, what my life would have been if I'd given the wrong answer, or I couldn't have answered it. I might not have got into the RAF, and whether I liked it or not, I might have found myself in the Army, or, God forbid, in the Navy. Yes, it's interesting. There was a follow-up to that many years later after the war, when I was down at Brighton, and there was a gathering of Hell's Angels, and I was admiring Kawasaki motorcycle. But I've always been very keen on motorcycles and motorcycling. And there was a Kawasaki that I was examining, and one of these beardies appeared from nowhere and said, rather aggressively, "What are you looking at?" And I said, "I was looking at your motorcycle, rather admiring it." So, he's a little bit mollified. And I said, "Do you maintain it?" "Well, of course I do," he said. And I said, "In that case, you'll have no difficulty in telling me how fast the camshaft runs in relation to the crankshaft." And at which point he invited me to do quite impossibly obscene things, which told me one thing: he didn't know the answer.
That's brilliant. What a lovely story.
Yeah, so going back to the interview board, when they laughed and I said I was in, they followed it up by saying to me, "If you weren't selected for pilot training, what role would you accept?" And I hesitated, and I saw all their faces falling, and I thought, if I don't say I will accept anything, I shall be out again, you see. So I thought, well, if they offer me something like being a rear gunner, I can always decline it. So even if I say I'll accept anything, so of course I said I'll accept anything, at which point they all cheered up no end, and they said, "Well, we've decided we will select you for pilot training." So that was rather nice. And the next thing that happened was that I went up to, I was sent up to an ITW initial training wing in Scarborough to be made fit. I thought I was fit before I got there, but anyway, I was up there for about 4 or 5 weeks, and the sergeant came in and said, "Be ready to move in the morning, have all your gear packed and ready to go." He said, "You were posted out." So I said to him, "Where are we going, Sergeant?" And he said, "Well, you'll find out when you get there." And a typical reply. And but when we got there, after a long sea journey, all up round Iceland and everywhere else, and into Canada, eventually, I finished up at a place called Lakeland in Florida, where I was taught to fly by what was then the American Army Air Corps. But remember, when I went out there in the beginning of 1941, America wasn't in the war, so I had to be formally demobilized in Canada to avoid me being interned when I got into America.
Wow.
So I went out there nominally as a civilian, but it was an odd experience. It was a sort of environmental and other challenge, because when my last meal over here would be a doorstep of bread, piece of floury margarine, and if I was lucky, a scoop of jam out of a tin, and a mug of cocoa. And when I got out to America, there was a bar about a quarter of a mile long, covered with every food imaginable: sides of beef, ham, southern fried chicken, you name it. And there was a guy behind the bar, and I said to him, "What can I have?" And he said, "Well, you can have anything and everything, it's up to you." So it was quite a shock. But the other shock, which was even greater, was that they had this weird West Point Code. Now, for those that have not heard of the West Point Code, it requires you as a cadet, if you break the rules, to report yourself. And if you didn't report yourself, it was incumbent on your fellow cadets to report you. Well, over here, as we all know, if you break the rules and get away with it, hallelujah. And if anybody was snitched on you, he'd be cast into outer space, never to return. So Yeah, it was quite a challenge. I never reported myself, and I certainly never snitched on anybody. But I kept my head down because I wanted to be a qualified pilot. I wanted to get my wings. In this case, it was American wings, of course. And after a period of training and going through, flying the little Stearman and onto a Voltee and eventually onto what the Americans called the 86, which you would know as the Harvard, I qualified and got American wings. And of course, then came the next shock. After I went up to Canada to pick up my uniform, I was told to report back to my station in Dothan, Alabama. And there I was met by the station commander, and he said, I suppose you think you're going home? And I said, well, what else? And why am I here? And he said, well, we've had Pearl Harbor, and we've got this big expansion scheme on for training, and we're holding back half a dozen of you chaps to be instructors. And so I said, instructors, hold it, sir. I said, yesterday, as it were, I was a cadet. Today I've got American wings, and you tell me that tomorrow I'm going to be an instructor. And he said, that's right. And I said, well, it's going to be the blind leading the blind. And he said, I don't care what you think. He said, in the morning, you'll go down on the flight line. There'll be 6 American cadets, and you'll be responsible for them. And he opened the door and kicked me out into the night. So that's how I became an instructor. 18 months later, when I left, the self-same station commander handed me a certificate that said that Pilot Officer Bell had completed a course of instruction to qualify as an instructor on 86 aircraft. Well, I never had a day's instruction on being an instructor in my life. So, I mean, it was all a con, wasn't it? But I enjoyed my stay in America. They once I was qualified, of course, they kicked you around unmercifully as cadet, but that was their method of training, and they held over you the threat of immediate expulsion if you broke any of the rules or you failed to measure up. And I thought this wasn't a very good method of training, although, in point of fact, if you could put up with it, I feel, looking back, I think the American training was second to none. But they had this nasty arrangement whereby you were under the threat of expulsion. I've known people that were expelled within a sort of a week or two of getting their wings, which seemed to me extraordinarily wasteful. So when I got American cadets, I said my method of training is different to the American Army Air Corps. I said, you can take it from me that unless you do something diabolical, you'll all qualify. And of course, it took the stress out of it straight away. And I think that if you teach people who are not under stress, as against people who are under stress, you get better results. But there we are. Who am I to say? I benefited from what I regard as probably one of the best training systems in the Western world, and it stood me in very good stead.
So how much flying did you get while you were doing that, Colin? Because obviously a lot of the stories in build-up to the war and early training for our RAF pilots was that you had people, not least in the Battle of Britain and things, with very few hours. You had obviously done quite a lot of flying in America.
Oh, yes. By the time I got on to operations, Bob, I'd amassed over 1,000 hours.
Wow. Yeah, significant amount. And most of that doing the training and instructional work
that was being both training, being trained, training, and back in this country, conversion onto twin-engine Blenheims, and then training to be a night fighter, because that's what I wanted to be, but it never came about. I finished the course and could never get a posting. So one day, Don Bennett's recruiting sergeant, a chap called Mahadi, Group Captain Mahadi, came down.
Don Bennett refers to Air Vice Marshal Don Bennett, who rose to be the youngest Air Vice Marshal in the Royal Air Force during the Second World War. He led the Pathfinder Force from 1942 until the end of the Second World War, and has been described as one of the most brilliant technical airmen of his generation. Outstanding as a pilot and a fantastic navigator, he was obviously an ideal choice for the Pathfinder role. Group Captain Hamish Mahadi worked for Don Bennett, as Colin says, essentially as the recruiting sergeant. He was the group training inspector in the Pathfinder Force and was responsible for the selection, recruitment and training of crews that were going to work in the Pathfinder Force. So really key players that Colin's mentioning here.
And he addressed us all in a hall and said, if anybody's got 1,000 hours or more, I'll recruit him straight in to the Pathfinder Night Light Striking Force, flying Mosquitoes. And I thought, well, this is good for me. So I kissed goodbye to the idea of being a night fighter, and I became one of Bennett's Light Night Striking Force.
All your operational flying was Mosquito, yes?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so just talk about the Mosquito. I mean, it's a legendary airplane.
The Mosquito was the very best aircraft in World War II. I once flew a Spitfire, and inevitably people asked me how the Spitfire compared to the Mosquito. And I said, there is nothing that the Spitfire can do that the Mosquito can't do. They're both fully aerobatic. And I said, the Mosquito has got 2 Spitfire engines, so as the Americans would say, no contest.
That's fantastic. I was lucky enough to fly Spitfires when I was on the Battle of Britain Memorial flight.
Yeah.
So I've had that experience of the airplane.
But you've never flown a Mosquito?
No, sadly.
Well, I feel sorry for you.
Yeah.
There are very few flying Mosquitoes left.
Yeah, it's a real rarity.
Yeah, but the Mosquito, I mean, it could do anything virtually. It could photographic reconnaissance, Pathfinder work, such as I was on, Night Striking Force, coastal attack, reconnaissance. It could manage whatever activity it was called upon to do. It would do it, but you have to remember it couldn't, for example, carry Barnes-Wallis's bouncing bomb. You needed a Lancaster for that. It couldn't drop the earthquake bomb that tipped the Tirpitz over. You needed a Lancaster for that. So when it came to carrying very, very heavy munitions, it had to be the Lancaster. Not many people know that sound like Michael Caine, do I? Not many people know that the Germans had got a V3 weapon that they were assembling on the north coast of France. And this device had got long-barreled guns, and it was going to fire rocket-assisted shells, and they were planning to plump these into the city of London at the rate of, I think, about 12 or 14 a minute, you know. It would have made the city of London quite uninhabitable, but they'd got 6 feet of concrete above these guns, and Hitler had been assured by his people that no bomb would penetrate this, and it was virtually unassailable. Well, you see, as often happens, the Germans got it wrong. That they didn't realise that Barnes-Wallis had got this earthquake bomb, and Barnes-Wallis said, we won't bother to drop it on the setup. We'll drop it alongside it, and they'll create such an earthquake that it'd tilt the whole thing over. And so it happened. I think it tilted it over by about 20 degrees, and after that, of course, it was unusable. So you needed a Lancaster for that. Again, the Mozzie, good as it was, couldn't have done that job.
Yeah, for sure. No, an incredibly capable airplane, and I think I'm just amazingly envious you did so much time flying it. But I'm really interested as well in the kind of operational phase of your career beyond the flying. We'll come to the flying in a minute, maybe, but the living conditions, what it was like when you got back to the UK, having done your training. What was that whole experience like as you built up into the Pathfinder Force and being in war? I mean, there are so few of you left now that have that experience of having gone through that. I think it's really important today that people remember that, what it was like and what the conditions.
Very important. And that's why I'm very glad to take part in these podcasts or talks or lectures, call it what you will, because I think it's most important the younger generation should understand that the objective of Bomber Command was to destroy the German manufacturing capacity to attack us. And by us, I mean our men, our women, and our children. And I think, by and large, we did a pretty good job. I have particularly in mind the Peenemünde base, where the Germans were developing V1, V2, and V3 weapons, and how Lancasters went out there once it was realised what was happening, and they bombed it so thoroughly and caused so much devastation that when the commandant, who was lunching with Hitler, heard of it, he came down and surveyed the mess that Peenemünde was in, and it caused him so much grief that he had a heart attack and he died, which I thought was very satisfying.
Another result in that outcome. Yeah, but going back to the story, if you like, on the living conditions and where you were, and you talked about Downham Market. What was it like? What was it like just living there?
Conditions when I arrived at Downham Market, we had Nissen huts behind a church, which was Bexley Church, and the officers' mess was in the priory, or whatever they called it. But the actual conditions, sleeping conditions, were very primitive. We were sort of 12 or 14 aircrew in a Nissen hut. It was perishing cold, and it's very primitive. As one of our chaps says, this isn't officers' accommodation. Well, it may not have been, but that's what we had to put up with. And the objective was to get aircraft in the air and attack Germany. And everything else was, less important.
Yeah, secondary. So how much did you actually fly when you were back on operations? How regularly were you flying?
Well, normally we did 2 nights on and 1 night off. The nights that we had off, we had a choice of either going up to the Boozers in King's Lynn or alternatively going down to Cambridge in the other direction and getting a meal in one of the Greek restaurants. It has to be understood that under wartime regulations, the most anyone was allowed to pay for a meal was, in today's currency, 30p. So you couldn't really get much more than a sort of spam fritters and that sort of thing. But, of course, the Greeks were all into the black market activity, and if you were prepared to pay the money, not 30p, but perhaps 4 or 6 times that figure, you could get almost anything you want, whether it was chicken or steak or whatever. So we used to go down there and patronise because what else could we spend our money on?
But you did, so when the night's off and when you weren't actually flying, what was that like? Was it kind of a reasonably normal life, or were you living in a kind of constant threat of bombing?
I was very fortunate. I had my wife, because I was married by then, my wife joined me on just outside the station. I was lucky enough to secure part of a house in Downham Market where I lived with my wife, and a charming couple looked after us. And I always say that my wife was the one who ought to have got any decorations and awards, because she used to see me fly out and have to wait for me to come back. I brainwashed her into thinking that I'd always come back, and I probably brainwashed myself. So unfortunately, it all worked out that way. But I did really live a very comfortable life. I mean, if you want to have a fight a war in the air, you can't have it better than that, can you?
No, that's true. And I think, interestingly, even today, was so true on operations. I think the families take the brunt of that difficulty. They're at home while we're away doing what we do. And then the operations are very different. And luckily we get less people shot down. We lose less people. Yeah. But it's still a lot of pressure and a lot of stress on the families. So some things haven't changed.
Much more pressure on my wife, because she had we had a little girl by then, only 6 weeks old, and I think the pressure on her was very considerable. But she was a wonderful girl, and she'd been in the Women's Royal Air Force until she married me, and then of course once she became pregnant, she had to accept a discharge. And but she was a wonderful girl, and we were married for 73 years.
I know, that's an amazing story. Yeah, 73 years married from all that time, and having seen so much through that time as well. Clearly,
well, if you live as long as I have, you're bound to have seen quite a lot in your lifetime and observed a lot. And but sadly, I lost her 8 years ago. And I'm just now an old geezer doing his best.
Well, you're doing a remarkable best, I have to say. Can I just take you back to flying out of Dun and Market and the sorties themselves? Can you just kind of talk us through what that was like? What was the process like for the planning, the briefing, the flying? How was that whole experience?
Well, I think it followed the normal routine for a bomber crew. We've flight tested the aircraft in the morning. In the afternoon, the navigators were told what courses they had to fly. All the information was fed down by group. So the navigators probably knew a lot more than I did, or the pilots did. Bear in mind that we had one navigator, one pilot. And then, of course, come the evening, we'd all go in, pilots and navigators together, would go into the main briefing room, and they would we'd be addressed by the flight commander and the station commander, and they'd pull back the curtain and show what the target was. And of course, the worst target of all was Berlin, and nobody wanted to go to Berlin. Berlin was a very dangerous place, where you gave a hot time going in, over the target and going out. And, well, there we are, I had to go to Berlin 13 times.
Wow.
And that was a bit worrisome, but there we are, it was war. And in war, you have to do as you're told and get on with the job, don't you?
You weren't at all superstitious on the 13th flight to Berlin?
Superstitious?
Yeah.
No, I think I was a bit thick. I hadn't got much imagination. There was a wonderful pilot, Sailor Milan, in the Battle of Britain, and he said in his experience, survivors were those possessed of not too much imagination. I know that fear kills, because I had a perfect example of it. We had a Canadian couple come in, a pilot and a navigator. And before I go any further, may I say that the Canadians were probably some of the best crews. They were exceedingly brave, they were highly skilled, and they got press on the spirit. And I was lucky enough to have a Canadian navigator, and he was a brilliant man. But this particular pair of Canadians were young, and they were quite obviously appalled at at the prospect of going out to Berlin because it was their first trip.
Oof.
And when they saw what the target was, it was obvious that they were terrified, to put it no higher than that. And I could see they were upset, so I walked. I'd done about 30 operations by then, so I walked across and I said, is there anything I can do to help you? All I could get out of the pilot was he kept saying over and over again, I'm not coming back from this operation. And his navigator looked exceedingly upset too. And I couldn't get anywhere with them, so I walked back to my Canadian navigator, who was an ex-lumberjack. He was a very tough hombre. And I said, I can't get anywhere with them. You go across and have a go. And he was with them for about 5 minutes. And he came back to me and said, well, I can't do any more than you've done. All I can get out of this chap was a repetition of saying, I know I'm not coming back. And they never did. So I think fear can kill you. We never know, of course, whether they were shot down or whether they spiraled out of control or whatever. But the chap's forecast, when I'm not coming back, he was dead right.
Very, very sad. I mean, I'm always amazed when I look at the operations you flew at that time, the number of aeroplanes, mostly by night, with the aids and the lack of aids you had in terms of working to deconflict the formation and so on, that you didn't have more mid-air collisions, you didn't have more people going completely into the wrong place. When I was in the Air Force flying complicated missions, we obviously did an awful lot of preparation, an awful lot of planning with a lot more capability and equipment. And it must have been really difficult on those very long missions. I mean, going from the UK to Berlin and back with the company of hundreds, if not thousands of other airplanes. How was that? What was that like?
Well, of course, we flew in isolation. Only on one occasion did I fly in the formation, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But to deal with your question, I had this brilliant navigator. I picked him out because he was old. He was all of 28 when I was... and I remember we were asked to crew up, and people were crewing up all over the place, and some guy jumped on a stool and said, who wants a drunken navigator? And I thought, well, I don't want him. I was very picky, and I waited, and nobody particularly wanted to crew up with me, and I didn't see anybody I particularly wanted to crew up with until I saw this elderly navigator of 28 sitting at a table looking pretty miserable with a Canada flash on his shoulder. So I walked up to him and I said, have you found yourself a pilot? Nope, he says. So I said, what experience have you had? And he said, what experience have you had? Which I thought was fair enough. And I said, well, I've been an instructor out in the States. And he said, oh, looking a bit mollified. He said, well, I've been a navigation instructor in Canada. I said, well, you found yourself a pilot. And, of course, I found myself the very, very best navigator any man could wish to have. He wasn't much fun, but then I wasn't looking for somebody that was fun. I was looking for somebody that was a good navigator, and he was more than good. He was brilliant. And, well, I think we formed a good team. But, of course, nobody can explain to you what your first operation is like. But our first operation was on a place called Hanover, and we flew out to Hanover, and accurately. But when we got there, it was surrounded in cloud, and we didn't know what to do, and we sort of circled around, and then, of course, the German anti-aircraft fire opened up on us, and it caused us a bit of alarms, but eventually we saw a marker that was going down, so we bombed on that, and we got a reputation of being a press-on crew because we were the only one on the flight that bombed on a marker. But it was just, it was a reputation that didn't last long. But on the way back, and this was our first trip, we passed over Emden, and this was the only occasion I think my navigator let me down. And of course, we looked ahead and we saw some flashes in the sky. And my navigator, Doug, said to me, I wonder what they're shooting at, you see. Well, next moment, the Emden, you probably realise, is a naval base. And the naval gunners were absolutely shit hot. And they hammered away at us, and it caused me an enormous amount of alarm. And I put the aircraft into a dive, and we dropped down from about 25,000 feet to 10,000 feet. And I think we exceeded all known safety limits for a Mosquito. In fact, I had the devil's own job pulling it out of dive, and I only did it with the aid of a trim, elevator trim. Eventually I got it out of the dive, and it could have brought our tour to our very first flight on a tour to abrupt end. But anyway, we got away with it, and we became more accustomed to being under fire. And one develops, you get experience, and you know better how to deal with it.
Yeah, I recognise that myself, actually, from the operational flying I did. I mean, the first time flying over Iraq, where this sort of black puffy clouds started appearing around the aeroplane, and I go, well, it's a bit funny, what's that? And I suddenly realised it was flak.
Well, you know what I'm talking about.
Exactly. It was
but nobody can tell you until you've done it what it's like.
Very surreal experience. Well, you mentioned Berlin, and you've obviously mentioned that Emden thing. Are there any other specific missions that really stood out for you in any particular way that you did?
Well, the only time I flew in formation was when we were told that there was an engineering works out at Duisburg, and Harris wanted it blotted out.
Colin is referring to Marshal of the Royal Air Force Sir Arthur Harris, known as Bomber Harris, who was the Commander-in-Chief of Bomber Command from February 1942 for the remainder of World War II. And he was instrumental in all the activities at Bomber Command over that time. So inevitably, as a result of some of the activities of Bomber Command, particularly bombing of cities, etc., he was a controversial figure. But there can't be any doubt that he was very much a leading light for his crews, and was a huge figure in the Royal Air Force over that time period.
So he arranged for a whole squadron of Mosquitoes to go in formation behind a lead aircraft that had got oboe. Oboe was a very, very advanced form of navigation in those days, and it was accurate within a few yards on the ground. And so then we formatted it behind this oboe lead aircraft, and we were told that when we're approaching the target, he'd say approaching, and then when he said bomb bay open, we all opened our bomb bay. It's all done, over the open air, and then when he said bombs away, we would all jettison our bombs at the same time as he jettisoned his. Well, it was 100% successful. We just wiped out the engineering work. So, but that was the only time I flew in formation, and at 10,000 feet. And it was it wasn't a nice experience. We took a hell of a hammering from anti-aircraft fire, and they brought one of our chaps down, but fortunately it wasn't me.
That pressure thing comes up obviously often here, where, you were under constant pressure, 2 nights on, 1 night off, losing people obviously very regularly. How did you handle the pressure personally? How did you handle that? What was your outlook for it?
Well, to be perfectly frank, and I've already told you I was a bit thick, I didn't find the pressure all that great. It was just a job, and I got on with it. When we were flying, we were flying. When we weren't flying, we were relaxing. And in my case, I used to join up with my wife, and we'd push a pram with my baby daughter in it down to the Crown Public House in Downham Market and join up with other air crew and sing songs and drink beer. And it was all really a very sort of a happy occasion. I can't remember any particular pressure.
Wow, amazing, given all of that.
I was going to ask you, the accuracy of the aids like oboe and G was great, but most of your bombing, I suspect, was done with a conventional bomb sight. But how accurate did it turn out to be? How accurate was your fine navigator as a bombardier?
Well, I don't really know. That's the short answer. All I know is that in the run-up to the target, of course, we had to keep it straight and level, and that was the most dangerous time from anti-aircraft fire. Incidentally, I make the point here, there was no German propeller-driven aircraft that could fly as fast as we could. So night fighters weren't a particular problem, although in an attempt to overcome this problem, the Germans used to stack Focke-Wulf 190s at 30,000 feet, and they called them wild boar squadrons, and they used to dive down on us and try and pick us off. But if you saw these guys coming, you could usually avoid them, and then they'd whistle by, and by the time they'd sort of worked their way to try and catch up with you again, it was too late, you had gone. So it, but once, of course, you found the target and you bombed, and I wasn't a marker. I emphasise I was not a marker. We did other things apart from backup on bombing, but, you know, the camera flashed as soon as you'd dropped the bombs, so they could see back at base whether you'd gone over the target. I think the camera, quite apart from recording the result, was also a good indication as to whether, as a crew, you'd done your job, or whether you'd... I mean, it was known that some American crews just went straight off to Sweden and got themselves interned. But I think that's a bit hard, because the Americans who flew B-17s were the bravest of the brave. They had a tour of 25 missions, and the majority of them never got beyond 8, and many of them never got beyond 5. And I take my hat off to these guys. They were the victims of the top brass who believed that if you flew in formation and you could shoot down anything that came within range, well, that was the theory. But like so many theories, it didn't work. And they paid a very, very heavy price. But they, as I say, they were the bravest of the brave. And the only person that I knew that completed 25 missions was Jimmy Stewart, the actor.
Yeah.
And he did it. God knows how he got away with it, but there we are. Yeah.
Yeah, and they, of course, were flying in daylight all the time, weren't they? Were
flying in daylight.
Were all your missions at night?
Yes, with the exception of that one on Duisburg. That was in daylight.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, just the night bit as well. I think if you're not flying in formation, it makes it a little bit easier, I guess. But you still must have been conscious you had a lot of other airplanes around you a lot of the time.
Yes. Well, usually we took off behind the heavy bomber force, and because we'd overtake them, and then we'd arrive first. And we would be vectored round, not through them. But on one occasion, one group navigation officer sort of screwed up, and he put us flying through the main bomber stream at night. And there was it was dark and it was raining, and the first thing you would see is a outline of a bomber, whoosh, you see, because we'd be going perhaps 100 miles an hour faster than they were going, and we whoosh past it, and you think, bloody hell, what's that? And the next moment it'd be another one you'd go past, and it was very dangerous indeed. And when I got back, I said to one of these gunners on Lancaster's, because we shared a airfield, but we had 635 Squadron, which was a Lancaster Pathfinder Squadron, and we had, of course, 608 Squadron, which is my squadron with Mosquitoes. And I said to one of these gunners in the Lancaster Squadron, where we had this unfortunate experience, well, he said, it's a good thing you got by without us seeing you, because if you come up behind us, he said, we didn't wait to see if a twin-engine aircraft was friend or foe. We'd immediately fired at it. So we did not exactly thank that group navigation officer. If we'd had our way, he'd have finished up with a high-pitched voice.
Yeah, I can well imagine. That must have been a scary experience for sure. And when you mentioned the Americans did 25 missions, that was their plan. What was the RAF's operational 50 missions?
On Mosquitoes. When we first arrived at the flight, we were interviewed by the flight commander, and he said, look, why don't you chaps sign up for 2 tours now instead of just 1, because I'll give you more interesting work. And I looked across at my very experienced Canadian navigator, and I waited for him to reply. And he said to the flight commander, I'm looking for the Victory Medal, not the VC.
Yeah, probably very wise, I'd imagine.
I always remember, too, that Don Bennett said on one occasion, if you're joining the Pathfinder group in the hope of getting a VC, well, you may get a VC. But he said, I guarantee one thing, it'll be a posthumous one.
Yeah, not ideal, that's for sure. Colin, I'm conscious, having read the book that Doug Redman's son wrote about your experiences. There are a few stories in there that I think the listeners to this would be fascinated by. One of those, you had a shell explode underneath the airplane at one point.
Well, yes. This was, I think it really was due to it was certainly due to my inexperience, because has to be understood that anti-aircraft fire over Berlin, or indeed anywhere, there was a lapse of time between they fired the shell and the shell reaching you. And remember, we were flying 4 miles up in the sky, so there was a significant period of time. So the Germans, although they had radar on you, which were connected to their searchlights and guns, they had to predict where you would be. And that's why it was known as predicted anti-aircraft fire. And if you had any sense, unless you were on the bombing run, you made sure that where the shells were going to explode, you were somewhere else. But on this occasion, I'm afraid through inexperience, I allowed myself to get caught, and a shell exploded under the aircraft, and it lifted the aircraft up. And although I didn't realise what had happened, it had interfered with the flow of petrol to the carburetor, because we had old-fashioned carburation systems, unlike the Germans who had fuel injection. Well, anyway, the long and short of it is it caused power to be cut from both engines, and all I found was that the propellers were windmilling around without any power. And that's not a happy situation, at which point my navigator, Doug, leaned across to me and said, and I thought it was a bloody stupid question, he said, what do we do now? Well, there was only one thing we could do. I said, we wait. So I put it into a glide, and after seemed an interminable period of time, the power came on again, and I angled the aircraft away from Berlin. And then Doug said, I leaned across to Doug at this point and said, you weren't frightened, were you, Doug? And he said, no, I wasn't frightened. I was bloody terrified. And that was formed the title of the book that his son subsequently wrote a few years back. And I think it encapsulated it rather well.
Yeah, it does. It's a great book. It is a really, really good book.
Somebody said to me, how did you feel? I think it was Kay Burley on Good Morning Britain. She said, how did you feel about somebody writing about your experiences? And I said, well, it didn't really surprise me because most of the material I gave to Ian Redmond.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. On these very long missions, I mean, staying awake must have been a challenge. You're flying at night. You've got to get your body tuned into operating at night. How did you cope with that?
Well, I have one thing in common. It's probably the only thing in common with Sir Winston Churchill. We're both capable of closing our eyes and dropping off to sleep at the drop of a hat. And it was no exception for me when I was flying over Germany. And when I pulled away from the target, in the knowledge that no propeller-driven aircraft could catch up with me, I used to level the plane off at 25,000 feet. And in those clear conditions, if you trimmed up the aircraft, it would almost fly itself. We didn't have an autopilot, but as I say, if you trimmed it up carefully and one thing and another, and then I'd say to Doug, now I've set it on course, I'm going to have a little nap, because I used to take a little pillow with me. And that's why Doug said he could fly the plane as well as I could, you see. And I put my head down and I said, give me a nudge if it goes off course, and I'll sort of level and set it all up again. And I said, if we get back to Downham Market, give me a real nudge and I'll land the bloody thing. And yes, I used to have frequent naps, and they were sort of cat naps. I used to do this when I was instructing when I was out in America. So it was not a new experience for me. And but as I say, on one occasion I was travelling back, and there was a God Almighty bang under my starboard wing. And Doug, another silly question, he said, what was that? And I said, well, it was a shell, wasn't it? And we checked over everything and there was no damage done, but it sort of rocked us about a bit. And when we got back and I was being debriefed, I said to the debriefing officer, we had this odd experience coming back. A shell came out from nowhere, as it seemed. And he laughed. Well, it was all right for him. I mean, he never travelled out over Germany, did he? He used to stay at home all the time. And he laughed and he said, where did this happen? And Doug pointed to the chart, and this guy laughed again and said, oh, you flew over a German anti-aircraft training school. He said, well, you might not know, but most of the trainees were German women, most of them girls around about the age of 17. And he said, do you know they're only allowed one shell a night? And I said, he said, you came sailing along and there they were polishing up their sights and you went stooging right over them. And of course they let off their one shell. And I said, well, it's very accurate shooting. It damn nearly brought us down. But yes, that's the story of my having my naps at night.
So did Doug have any naps as well? Or?
No. He had to stay awake. That's what navigators required.
Outstanding. You've talked as well about the speed of the Mosquito and nothing really else could catch it. How did that translate when you got to the end of the war and Me-262 jet fighter coming in from the German side?
Well, we had a device on the back that picked up air-to-air radar. So if a German jet fighter, which was an Me-262, which could do 100 miles an hour faster than we could go, once started painting you, then a white light would appear on my instrument panel. And this white light appeared one night. I was ready for it. I thought it might happen. And I'd already decided what I would do if it happened. And I tipped the aircraft over on one wing and I dropped down 10,000 feet, like a stone. And Doug, of course, started belly aching like hell. Navigators are always belly aching, but and Doug was no exception. He said, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" And I said, "Well, you've seen the white light come on." "Oh," he said, "I've heard that there's a lot of ghosting that comes on, that in electrical disturbances you could get a white light come on when it's not an enemy fighter at all." And I said, "Do you want me to hang around and find out?" And that quieted him down a bit. And then he went on to say, "Well, I'm not convinced." He said, "I can't see him." And I said, "Well, you ought to thank your lucky stars you couldn't see him," because I said, if you could see him, he could see us, and we'd be dead, because the firepower of ME262 is such that a single blast would turn you into confetti. But he went on bleating about it, and because he bleated so much about it, I eventually got rid of this guy. I took him down low. Of course, jet aircraft use a lot more fuel down low than they do up high. And I knew he'd only got 45 minutes from the time that he took off to the time he got back to base. So I skedaddled around as low as I could, and eventually this white light didn't reappear. But Doug always left me feeling uneasy. Was it really or wasn't it? Until I met Winkle Brown, Captain Winkle Brown, who probably was the most experienced pilot in Navy pilot, sadly, in World War II. He'd flown everything, and I chatted to him. This was a long time after the war, and he simply said, "You were very lucky to be alive. You could have well been a casualty. You did the right thing." So that made me feel better. But I was once interviewed by some guy from the Daily Telegraph, and I described the experience there. And then he wrote up about it, and before he published the article, he read it out to me. And he said a number of Mosquitoes were shot down by ME262s over Berlin. And I said, "Hold it." I said, "I didn't say that." He said, "I know you didn't." But he said, "I got it from an independent source, the Ministry of Defence." So there we are.
Well, it was your main protection, wasn't it? To just go as fast as you could, because so little could catch you. You had no other.
Well, you couldn't afford to be wrong. And that's what I said to Doug at one stage. I said, "Well, it's all very well, but I can't afford to be wrong."
No, absolutely. How many missions did you do, Colin, in the end?
50.
50 missions.
Yeah.
And when you'd achieved your 50 missions, what happened? What happened then?
Well, Doug went back to Canada and enrolled at McGill University and took a degree in forestry. And I think he finished up as president of the Forestry Commission or something of that sort. So you can see the caliber of the man. I mean, he was a brilliant man. I was given an opportunity of either going and being an instructor or ferrying mosquitoes back from London, Ontario, that's Canadian-built mosquitoes, and bringing them over to this country. So I opted to do that. But had I known the losses that were suffered on that route, and not helped by the fact that there was a saboteur in the factory in Canada, London, Ontario, I think I would have volunteered to have done another tour. It would have been safer. But there we are, of course, I never had another navigator that was as good as Doug. I had quite a number, and many of them a lot more fun than Doug, but they're nothing like as good at navigation.
Talking about the Mosquito, I find it still remarkable that we managed to build a wooden aircraft of such high performance, how well did it hold together?
How well did it hold together? Well, very well. I'm still amazed that a wooden aircraft like that could, how shall I put it, stand the strain of two Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. But it could, and in fact, some of them were even fitted with a 6-pounder anti-tank gun, which was a Merlin's gun. And a chap I knew, Des Curtis, attacked a submarine with this. And although he came under heavy anti-aircraft fire from the submarine, he nevertheless persisted and bunged a shell straight into the conning tower and sank it.
Brilliant. Brilliant.
Of course, it was overtaken, I mean, in the sense that they put in rockets subsequently, which didn't cause the Molins was just an intermediate sort of situation. Yeah.
They even managed to produce a pressurized Mosquito, I gather.
No, the only pressurized Mosquitoes I knew were those that went on photo reconnaissance. And they used to go up very high. And I think they went above 30,000 feet. We were on oxygen, of course, all the time. We took off with oxygen because it helped with night vision. And we flew all the time, both from the time that we took off to the time we returned, had oxygen all the time. But Doug once said he could fly the plane as well as I could. Well, he got his chance because on one occasion at 25,000 feet, my oxygen supply failed. And you can't be at 25,000 feet without oxygen. And I remember saying to him very clearly, Doug, I'm feeling a bit tired, and I raised my arms above my head. The next thing I found, we were in a descending spiral at 10,000 feet, and Doug was desperately trying to revive me with an emergency oxygen bottle. I never let him get it.
Grief. Good job you had him there on that day, that's for sure.
And what was its single engine performance like? Because I gather there was, particularly on takeoff, a kind of a dead zone where if you lost an engine, you couldn't control the aeroplane in your
Well,
anymore.
let's put it this way. If you were I flew with Canadian-built Mosquitoes, and they had Packard Merlin engines, and it was known that on some of the Packard Merlins, they'd got weak conrods. And if a conrod failed on takeoff, that was it, because you'd lose an engine, and if you were taking off with a full load of gasoline, a full bomb load, you got your undercarriage down and your flaps down, there was simply nothing you could do. I mean, you just have to crash land it, and not a very happy experience. In fact, one of our rather naive young men, on hearing of this, said to our Australian wing commander, Scotty, what do you do in such a situation? He said, well, there's only one thing you can do. He said, you go in ahead and die like an officer and a gentleman.
No.
Oh, well said. Well said.
But the only vice, really, that the Mosquito suffered from, if you call it a vice, is that both propellers rotated in the same direction. And this caused a downward force on the port wheel. And for that reason, there was a tendency for it to swing off the direction of travel. But if you knew what you were about, you made sure that you gave a bit of extra boost to your port engine to counterbalance that. But it was something you had to watch out for. But that was really the only vice that it had. And but of course, occasionally you did lose an engine. I remember going out over the channel and seeing a whole stream of glycol sort of pouring away from my port engine, and I decided I I wouldn't go on with the mission. I mean, there was some press on people that actually went out on their missions on one engine. I wouldn't recommend it. I wasn't that press on, so I went back to Ford Aerodrome and I landed on one engine, not very difficult, because the Mosquito could fly almost as well on one as it could on two, once you got airborne, you know. And anyway, I landed and I got out with my nav and we went up into the mess and I started on my bacon and eggs and the steward came up and said, "Sir, there's an aircraft that's just come down from Downham Market to take you back." And I said, "Well, he'll have to wait until I've had my bacon and eggs, you see." So I thought he looked a bit uneasy, but he moved away and he came back a bit later and said, "The pilot who's waiting for you is becoming very irate, sir." So I said, "I don't care how irate he becomes. I don't care if it is the station commander himself." He said, "Well, actually, it is the station commander." I said, well. And we had a station commander then called Wing Commander Alabaster. He's gone now. And they say, what's the phrase, the Latin phrase, de mortuis non easy bonum, which translated for the peasants means don't say anything about the dead except good. And anyway, Alabaster sort of moans and groans about me being late in coming down. He said, "If I could have got you back to the station in time, you could have gone into the reserve aircraft and we'd have maintained our 100% output." And he said, "As it is, you wrecked it." So I let him go belting on and I kept my head down and I thought, well, he'd run out of steam sooner or later. And he did. So, yes. And on that phrase, de mortuis non easy bonum, there was a famous actress, Bette Davis, who hated another American actress called Joan Crawford. And on hearing that Joan Crawford had died, some woman said to Bette Davis, "Now, Bette," she said, "de mortuis non easy bonum, say nothing about the dead other than good." "Oh," she said, "Joan Crawford has died. Good."
Oh, no. Very last Mosquito question, Colin. Did you fly the same aeroplane most of the time?
Yes, I did. I flew an aircraft called K for King, and it's displayed. A painting of it is displayed in this club. It is a painting of the actual aircraft.
Yeah, it's a beautiful painting. I've seen it,
and it served me very well. And I was very sorry that when I heard after I finished my tour and another crew took over, they only flew it 5 missions and they got plastered by anti-aircraft fire and they couldn't find anywhere to force land it at night. So they bowed out over France and left it up there. Aircraft don't stay up in the air very long when they haven't got a crew. And so therefore, that was the end of poor old K for King. But I had another one that I flew occasionally, which was known as L for Leather. And L for Leather served us quite well, but it was not, to my mind, it didn't feel just as good as K for King. Yeah.
Terrific. When I do these podcasts, Colin, I tend to cover the highs and lows of people's lives and careers. What do you consider your high point of your very long life so far? What's the most memorable thing for you?
Most memorable thing in my life? Oh, marrying the best woman in the world.
I can imagine. With a very, very long marriage to boot. That's fantastic. No, what a lovely memory. Sadly, there's also a low point. What would be your low point?
Well, when I left the RAF at the end of World War II, and because my wife didn't want to be married to a peacetime officer, she said, "I've had enough of being married to a wartime officer, pilot." And she said, I don't want to be married to a peacetime one. So I said, well, what can I do? And she said, well, go back and complete your training as a chartered valuation surveyor. And I said, well, we're going to be very poor because nobody pays anybody very much while they're under a period of training. But once again, she showed her brilliance. She got in touch with the firm that I was working with, and where, incidentally, she worked before the war. And she got in touch with the manager who put me in touch with what was then the Inland Revenue Valuation Office. And out of the kindness of their heart, they gave me an appointment as a temporary valuation assistant that enabled me to go through and under the tutelage of one of the valuers, chartered surveyors, to become a chartered surveyor. It was a long, tedious process, and the money we received was, very, very small amount. And particularly as I'd bought a house, because when I was in America, not knowing what I was coming back to, I saved as much money as I could, and I saved what was then 5,000 American dollars, which is equivalent to £1,000. Well, back in 1946, £1,000 was a lot of money. It was a lot of money in America. And an American officer that I knew said to me, well, you've been saving this money. Do you mind asking me how much you've saved? And I said, well, $5,000. And he said, God damn. He said, that's a down payment on a Cadillac. Well, I wasn't interested in buying a Cadillac, but I did come back to this country, and with the aid of my savings, I bought a house with the aid of an extra loan from a bank manager, and I bought this rather modest little artisan cottage for £1,600, and I thought I was loading myself with debt for the rest of my life.
When you look at that in today's world, £1,600 to buy a house.
But as I said, my income, after paying off the bridging loan on the difference between the 1,000 I'd saved and the 600, while I was paying that back, and one thing, well, we were exceedingly poor, and life was a real struggle. And I think that probably was the lowest point in my career. I used to wander around valuing up properties for the Inland Revenue Valuation Office in places like Peckham and Camberwell, carrying a heavy bag. And I used to wander around and think, what the hell am I doing? What do I come down to? Because after all, I'd had a fairly responsible position as a flight lieutenant in the Air Force with quite a decent income. And now I was working for an organisation that was paying me a pittance. And it was a most peculiar experience. I always remember I wanted to clip papers together, and the chief clerk in the office said to me, well, we don't clip papers together, we pin them together. So he gave me a packet of pins. And after about a fortnight, I went up to him because I'd run out of pins, and I said, can I have another packet of pins? And he opened a little book and he looked inside and said, but I gave you a packet of pins a fortnight ago. You're not entitled to another packet for another week. And I thought, I've joined a madhouse.
Oh, my goodness. Did you miss the Air Force when you left it?
Oh, yes, I did. The comradeship in the Air Force and the security of an assured income and the fun and laughter. Yes, I missed it a lot, but I had to settle down to carving out a civilian career, and that I did. And eventually I sort of climbed the greasy pole, and I became what was known as the District Valuer Southwark, which, I thought it was a wonderful position, but most of my colleagues who became district valuers wanted to go to interesting places like Shrewsbury or Exeter or, well, Salisbury, delightful places, but nobody wanted to be the district valuer of Southwark. And so if you were in one of these nice places and you put your foot wrong, establishment would bear down on you, and you would see what was coming, and they'd say to you, how long have you been district valuer of Salisbury? And you would say, for 5 years, sir. And they'd say, well, how would you like to expand your experience by, say, going to Southwark? And they would say, God, anything but Southwark, you see. Well, if I put a foot wrong, they couldn't send me to Southwark because I was already there. It gave me a great deal of leverage.
Brilliant. Just changing tack completely, Colin. You mentioned pre-war, your parents, and the discussions with your parents about appeasement, them having gone through the First World War and seen that and seen what was happening in the build-up to the Second World War. Could you just expand on that a little bit about what those conversations were like?
Well, I was listening in to them. I didn't take part in it. After all, I knew nothing about World War I, excepting there were horrendous casualties. I mean, we lost 55,500 aircrew who were in night operations over Germany. And, of course, they've got the memorial on the other side of the road of the club to commemorate them. I think it's fair to say that in a single battle in a morning, we'd have lost over 50,000 souls in an attack on enemy lines in France or Germany, as the case may be. So really, the people were always receiving, as I understood from my mother and father, were always receiving telegrams to explain that their loved one had been lost or gone missing. And it must have been a horrific experience. I mean, it was known for people to sort of collapse on seeing a telegraph boy arriving with a telegram in those days. It left an indelible mark on my parents. And of course, I was just a teenage boy of 13 or 14. I was listening into it. It just underscores the point that I'm making all the time, namely that if you want to avoid a war, you've got to spend enough money on defence to deter a despot from attacking you. That is the key. That is the key. I mean, Democrats never start wars. I think with the one exception, that was the Iraqi war. But I've never known a democratic nation start a war. It's always caused by despots like Stalin or Hitler or Putin, to name but a few.
Yeah, and with that in mind, I mean, you've seen, as you've already said, a lot over your life. Inevitably, it's been a long life. You look now as a 103-year-old, soon to be 104-year-old, amazing man at everything that has gone on in the world and is going on in the world now. What do you look at from the geopolitical situation? How worried are you about where we are now with what is happening in the Middle East, what is happening in Ukraine with Russia, etc.? Do you think it's as dangerous as it was?
Well, you sort of set out a broad canvas for me. So let's deal with one thing at a time. The Ukraine. Well, it's absolutely vital that, from my standpoint, that we should continue to support the Ukrainians, because if Russia was successful in subjugating the Ukrainians, where does he stop? Does he go to the Baltic states, Lithuania, Poland? Where does he stop? Does he risk a clash with NATO? Who knows? The best thing, of course, is to make it so such a war of attrition that he's deterred. So it's, to my way of thinking, we must support the Ukrainians to the very best of our ability, which brings me, of course, to President Trump. Is he going to continue to support the support that the Americans have been giving to the Ukrainians? Because America has been giving much more support to the Ukrainians than any other country. And, of course, President Trump, quite rightly, is critical of the underspending of the NATO countries, particularly Germany, on defence. And I've now got the insane situation, in my judgment, that we've got a premier here that says he'll spend more on defence when we can afford it. I say to that, you cannot unafford it. It ought to be done now. So that's NATO and the Ukraine. And what if Trump pulls out his support? Well, we've just simply got to spend much, much more money on defence. And to their great credit, the Poles are already doing it. So that's Ukraine, that's NATO, position in out in Israel. Well, that's just horrendous, isn't it? I can understand why the Israelis are taking the line they are against Hamas and Hezbollah. It's very difficult for an ex-Bomber Command man to criticise what the Israelis are doing in their attacks on Gaza. But it is horrendous. Naturally, the Israelis want to be in a position whereby they stop any chance of Hamas attacking them again, much as we did with Germany. I mean, people will criticise us for attacking Dresden, but in point of fact, at the time that we were attacking Dresden, no different to the situation with Hamas. Hitler was sending a hailstorm of missiles over against us, just as Hamas still are sending rockets, and that goes for Hezbollah too, against the Israelis. So one can't help but feeling a great deal of sympathy for the position that the Israelis are in.
Yeah, it's a fascinating perspective, actually. I hadn't really thought of it like that when you look at it through your historical lens on Bomber Command. And that brings me to one other thought, just looking at post-war and the view taken about Bomber Command and people that had flown in Bomber Command. My father was a Blenheim pilot in World War II as well.
Did he survive?
He did, yeah. Luckily, otherwise I wouldn't have been talking to you now, that's for sure. So, yeah, he came through a good number of missions on 105 Squadron particularly. But I know, and I'm very conscious, you mentioned the Bomber Command Memorial opposite the RAF Club where we're doing this interview. And it took years for that to be built. It took years to award a Bomber Command clasp to the World War II.
Teeth of opposition, I believe, from the City Council.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just wonder how that feels or felt to you.
Well, I thought it was outrageous. I mean, when you consider what these guys did and the dedication of the bomber crews, I mean, there was a time when the Sterling crews, perhaps you'll get 4 captains of Sterling aircraft assembled together, and within 3 months of those 4, 3 would be dead. They'd either be shot down by German night fighters or shot down by anti-aircraft fire or whatever. So the survival rate there was 1 in 4. Quite horrendous. It could easily have happened to me if I hadn't been retained as an instructor out in America, and they'd sent me home. And when I got my American wings, I mean, I might easily be one of those guys, and I might be on the memorial across the other side of the road. It's a chilling thought, isn't it?
It certainly is. No, I'm totally in agreement with you. I think it took far, far too long for us to recognise that service. I mean, again, looking back to my Battle of Britain Memorial flight time, where obviously we have the Lancaster and the Dakota, it was great to be able to work with a lot of veterans, obviously now very much diminished in number.
Yeah.
And just explore that. You have been fantastic in some of your stories. I have one more question for you. You are one of very, very few people that live to such a great age, and you look outrageously healthy.
Well, appearances can be deceptive.
What's the secret? What have you done?
Well, Kay Burley asked me this on Good Morning Britain, and I said, well, there are two answers. There's the honest answer, and there's the amusing answer. Which one do you have? And she said, I'll have both. So I said, well, the honest answer is, remember this is going out live, I said the honest answer is the genes that you're born with. If you're lucky enough to be born with the right genes, and you don't get involved in, drug-induced sex and things of that nature, you might, with luck, get to 102 or even perhaps a bit longer. And the other, I said the amusing one is it's a combination of exercise, alcohol, and the love of good women with the odd bad one thrown in.
Colin, what a privilege to talk to you today. Thank you so much. It's amazing to have a conversation with someone who's seen so much over such a long period of time. It's truly amazing. Thank you.
Well, may I finish by stressing the words of Machiavelli. Machiavelli said, half of your life is luck, and the other half depends on yourself. Well, I've had a great modicum of luck in my life, and I'm very, very grateful for it.
Well, I'm grateful to you too. Thank you very much, Colin. I really hope you've enjoyed this amazing interview with Colin Bell. It really was such a huge privilege to have a chance to talk to him at such length about his incredible life and his experiences. Please share this widely on social media if you liked it, because I think it's such an important story for people to hear. It's really valuable for getting that message out from a generation that rapidly is disappearing from our world. And I would be hugely grateful if you could give me some feedback, if you could turn around and share this, like it, do all the normal things on all the normal channels. And if you really do like it, then please think about supporting the show directly, either through the link in the podcast notes that you'll find on your podcast channel, or alternatively going to www.patreon.com/leading4life, 4, and you'll find there the opportunity to support me directly as either a supporter, a champion, or a patron of the show. And I would be enormously grateful if you would consider doing that. It would make a world of difference to being able to continue doing such terrific interviews as this, and I hope you're willing to help me with that. Thanks very much. Speak soon. Bye.